The morning sun cast long shadows across rancher Bill Henley's weathered face as he stood before the empty feed bucket, his calloused hands trembling with a mix of frustration and heartbreak. For 17 days, Cisco, a magnificent chestnut stallion who had been his wife Cordelia's pride and joy, hadn't touched a single grain of oats, handful of hay, or even the sweetest apples from their orchard. Bill's weathered fingers traced the metal rim of the untouched water trough, remembering how Cordelia used to sing softly to Cisco every morning, her voice floating across the paddock like a gentle breeze through prairie grass. The horse had always responded to her melodies, ears perked forward, eyes bright with recognition and affection. But now, 3 months after Cordelia's sudden passing from a heart attack, Cisco stood motionless in the corner of his stall, his once proud head hanging low, his ribs beginning to show through his dulling coat. Dr. Maverick Crow, the local veterinarian, had examined Cisco twice in the past week, running every test imaginable. Blood work came back normal, no signs of colic, no dental problems, no physical ailments whatsoever. The horse was dying from something medicine couldn't diagnose, something that lived in the realm of the heart rather than the body. "I've seen this before," Dr. Crow had said quietly, packing his medical bag with the methodical precision of a man who'd delivered too much bad news. "Sometimes animals grieve just like people do when they lose someone they're bonded to." He'd left the sentence hanging in the air like morning mist, unwilling to voice what they both knew. Bill had tried everything. He'd brought in Cordelia's favorite carrots, the special grain mixture she'd always prepared with her own hands, even the molasses cookies she used to bake specifically for Cisco. Nothing worked. The horse would sniff each offering with mild interest, then turn away as if the very act of eating betrayed the memory of the woman who had loved him so deeply. The neighboring ranchers had begun to whisper among themselves at the weekly cattle auction. Some suggested putting Cisco out of his misery, a kindness, they called it. Others recommended selling him to someone who might have better luck breaking through his grief. But Bill couldn't bring himself to consider either option. Cordelia had rescued Cisco as a 3-year-old from an abusive owner, nursing him back to health with the patience and dedication of a mother caring for a wounded child. She'd spent countless hours in that very paddock, brushing his mane, whispering secrets into his ears, singing the old hymns she'd learned at her grandmother's knee. As the sun climbed higher into the Montana sky, Bill leaned against the fence post that Cordelia had painted bright red just last spring, watching Cisco's labored breathing. The horse's eyes, once bright and full of life, now seemed to look right through him, searching for a familiar silhouette that would never again appear at the paddock gate. With a halter in one hand and a song on her lips, the weight of impending loss pressed down on Bill's shoulders like a heavy winter coat, and for the first time since the funeral, he felt the hot sting of tears threatening to spill over. He was about to lose the last living piece of his beloved wife, and there seemed to be nothing he could do to stop it. The 17th night brought with it a bone-deep chill that seemed to settle into Bill's very soul as he made his way to the barn by lantern light. Cisco lay on his side in the straw, his breathing shallow and labored, his once magnificent frame now gaunt and fragile. The sight hit Bill like a physical blow, and he sank down onto a hay bale, the lantern casting dancing shadows on the barn walls. "I don't know what to do, old friend," Bill whispered, his voice cracking with emotion. "She always knew what you needed, always knew the right words, the right songs." He trailed off, remembering how Cordelia would sit for hours beside Cisco during thunderstorms, her voice steady and soothing as she sang "How Great Thou Art," until the horse's trembling subsided. That hymn had been her absolute favorite, learned at her grandmother's knee during childhood summers spent in rural Kentucky. She'd sung it on their wedding day, hummed it while cooking Sunday dinner, and whispered it as a prayer during the difficult years when they'd struggled to make the ranch profitable. It had become the soundtrack of their life together, woven into the fabric of their daily routines like golden thread through homespun cloth. Bill closed his eyes and tried to remember the melody, but his voice felt rusty and uncertain after months of grief-induced silence. Cordelia had always been the singer in their family, her voice clear and true as a mountain stream, while his was more suited to calling cattle than carrying a tune. But as he sat there in the dim barn, watching Cisco's labored breathing, something inside him shifted. "Art thou weary? Art thou languid?" he began tentatively, his voice barely above a whisper. The words felt strange on his tongue, rusty from disuse, but he continued, "Art thou sore distressed? It wasn't how great thou art. That would come later, but another hymn Cordelia had loved, one she'd often sung during difficult times." Cisco's ear twitched slightly, the first response Bill had seen from the horse in weeks. Encouraged, he continued singing, his voice growing stronger with each verse. The familiar words seemed to unlock something inside him, releasing the grief he'd been holding back since Cordelia's funeral. As he sang, tears began to flow freely down his weathered cheeks, each note carrying with it a memory of his wife's gentle voice. The barn filled with the sound of Bill's rough baritone, echoing off the wooden beams where barn owls nested and mice scurried through the rafters. It wasn't polished or perfect like Cordelia's had been, but it was honest and filled with love, the same love she'd poured into every song she'd ever sung to Cisco. Slowly, almost imperceptibly, Cisco's head began to lift. His eyes, which had been clouded with grief and exhaustion, seemed to focus for the first time in weeks. The horse struggled to raise himself into a sitting position, his movements weak but determined, as if Bill's voice had awakened something deep within his broken heart. Bill noticed the change and felt his own heart skip a beat. He continued singing, cycling through every hymn he could remember Cordelia humming around the house. "Blessed Assurance," "In the Garden," the old rugged cross, each one seeming to bring more life back into Cisco's dimming eyes. The connection between them was palpable, a bridge built of melody and memory, spanning the gulf that grief had carved between the living and their love for the departed. As the night wore on, Bill's voice grew hoarse, but he didn't stop. For the first time since Cordelia's death, he felt her presence surrounding them both, as real and comforting as the warm barn and the soft straw beneath their feet. Dawn was breaking over the crazy mountains when Bill finally reached the hymn that had been Cordelia's absolute favorite. His voice, now rough and strained from hours of singing, trembled as he began the opening lines of "How Great Thou Art." The words seemed to hang in the morning air like dewdrops on spider webs, each syllable carrying the weight of 37 years of marriage and love. "O Lord my God, when I in awesome wonder consider all the worlds thy hands have made." Bill's voice cracked on the high notes, but he pressed on, remembering how Cordelia would close her eyes when she sang this particular hymn, her face radiant, with a peace that seemed to come from somewhere beyond the physical world. Cisco's response was immediate and profound. The horse struggled to his feet, his legs shaking with weakness, but his eyes now blazed with a spark that hadn't been there since Cordelia's passing. He took one tentative step forward, then another, drawn by the familiar melody that had once been the soundtrack to his happiest days. Bill noticed the change and felt his heart leap with hope. He moved closer to Cisco, still singing, his voice growing stronger as he saw life returning to the horse's eyes. The animal's nostrils flared as if he were breathing in not just air, but the essence of beloved memories carried on the wings of song. "I see the stars, I hear the rolling thunder, thy power throughout the universe displayed." Bill continued, reaching out a gentle hand to stroke Cisco's neck. The horse didn't pull away this time. Instead, he leaned into the touch, as if drawing strength from both the physical contact and the spiritual connection that the hymn provided. Neighbors began gathering at the fence line as word spread through the valley that something miraculous was happening at the Henley Ranch. Jasper McGillicuddy, who owned the adjacent spread, stood with his hat in his hands, watching in amazement as the horse that veterinarians had given up on began to show signs of returning to life. Helena Fitzgerald, the local pastor's wife, wiped tears from her eyes as she recognized the hymn and understood its significance. Dr. Crow arrived just as Bill was beginning the chorus for the third time. The veterinarian had seen many things in his 30 years of practice, but he'd never witnessed anything quite like this. Cisco was actually walking now, moving slowly but steadily toward the water trough he hadn't touched in over 2 weeks. "Then sings my soul, my Savior God, to thee," Bill sang, his voice breaking with emotion as he watched Cisco lower his head to the water and take his first drink in days. How great thou art! How great thou art! The horse drank deeply, then lifted his dripping muzzle to look directly at Bill. In those deep brown eyes, the rancher saw something he hadn't seen in months, not just life, but joy. It was as if Cordelia's spirit had somehow been channeled through the familiar hymn, reminding Cisco that love doesn't end with death, but transforms into something eternal and sustaining. Helena Fitzgerald began singing along from her position at the fence, her clear soprano harmonizing with Bill's rough baritone. One by one, other neighbors joined in, their voices creating a chorus that seemed to fill the entire valley with hope and healing. The sound rose up into the Montana sky like incense, carrying with it prayers for the living, gratitude for the departed, and faith in the power of love to transcend even death itself. Cisco turned toward the gathered crowd, his ears perked forward with interest for the first time in weeks. The transformation was nothing short of miraculous, from a broken, dying animal to one who seemed to remember what it meant to be alive and loved. By mid-morning, word had spread throughout Silverbow County about the miracle unfolding at the Henley Ranch. Cars and pickup trucks lined the dirt road leading to the property as people came to witness what some were calling divine intervention and others simply the power of music to heal broken hearts. Cisco, meanwhile, had moved to his feed bucket and was cautiously sniffing the oats that had sat untouched for over 2 weeks. Bill continued singing, cycling through Cordelia's favorite hymns as if his voice were a lifeline, connecting the living to the eternal. With each song, Cisco seemed to grow stronger, more alert, more present in his own body. The horse finally took a small bite of oats, then another, his appetite slowly returning as the familiar melodies worked their healing magic. Local news reporter Quincy Blackthorne arrived with his cameraman, drawn by reports of the unusual story spreading through social media. As he interviewed neighbors and set up his equipment, he couldn't help but be moved by the scene before him. Here was grief transformed into grace, loss converted to love, death defeated by the simple power of remembered song. "Tell me what you're seeing here," Quincy asked Dr. Crow, who stood mesmerized by Cisco's transformation. "Honestly, I don't have a medical explanation for it," Dr. Crow replied, shaking his head in wonder. This horse was dying not from any physical ailment, but from a broken heart. "What Bill is doing here, it's beyond anything I learned in veterinary school. Sometimes the medicine that heals isn't found in any pharmacy." Reverend Augustus Wormsley from the local Methodist church had arrived and was leading a small prayer circle near the barn. His deep voice added a rich bass note to the ongoing hymn singing, creating harmonies that seemed to make the very air vibrate with spiritual energy. Even the birds seemed to have joined in, their songs blending with human voices in a natural symphony of hope. Bill paused in his singing only long enough to fetch fresh hay and refill Cisco's water trough. The horse watched his every movement with renewed interest, occasionally nickering softly as if trying to communicate something important. It was a sound Bill hadn't heard since before Cordelia's death, the sound of a horse who remembered what it meant to trust and hope. "He's asking for her, isn't he?" asked Delilah Rosenkrantz, an elderly neighbor who had known Cordelia since childhood. "The way he keeps looking toward the house, like he's expecting her to come walking out with that red halter of hers." Bill nodded, his throat too tight with emotion to speak immediately. Cordelia's red halter still hung on its hook in the barn, exactly where she'd left it on the morning of her heart attack. Neither Bill nor anyone else had touched it, as if moving it would somehow make her passing more final, more real. As the afternoon sun climbed higher, casting golden light across the paddock, something extraordinary happened. Cisco walked over to the fence where the crowd had gathered and began reaching his head over the rails, allowing strangers to pet his neck and whisper words of encouragement. It was behavior completely contrary to his recent isolation and depression, as if the hymns had not only restored his will to live, but had also rekindled his faith in human kindness. Children who had come with their parents were delighted by Cisco's gentle demeanor. 8-year-old Temperance Walsh, whose grandmother had sung many of the same hymns at bedtime, began humming along with the adults. Her pure, sweet voice seemed to particularly captivate Cisco, who stood perfectly still as she stroked his velvety nose through the fence rails. The scene had taken on an almost festival-like atmosphere, but with an underlying reverence that kept everyone's voices soft and respectful. This wasn't entertainment, it was witnessing the power of love to transcend death, the ability of music to speak directly to the soul, and the miracle of hope restored in the darkest of hours. As the sun reached its zenith, casting sharp shadows across the ranch, something even more remarkable began to unfold. Cisco, now eating steadily and drinking regularly, started exhibiting behaviors that Bill recognized from the old days when Cordelia was alive. The horse began what could only be described as dancing, lifting his hooves in rhythm with the hymns, tossing his head gracefully, and moving in the flowing, circular patterns that Cordelia had taught him during their years together. Sweet merciful heavens, breathed Wilhelmina Chandler, a retired music teacher who had driven over from the next county. That horse is keeping time. He's actually responding to the rhythm and melody structure of the hymns. Bill watched in amazement. As Cisco performed movements he hadn't seen in months, the gentle prancing step Cordelia had called Sunday walking, the proud arch of his neck when he heard applause, the way he would pause and cock his head as if listening for a particular voice among the chorus of singers gathered around his paddock. Dr. Crow was taking notes, documenting what he later would describe in veterinary journals as the most remarkable case of grief recovery he had ever witnessed. The horse's vital signs, which he checked periodically throughout the day, showed marked improvement with each passing hour. Heart rate normal, temperature stable, and most importantly, the will to live burning bright in eyes that had been dulled with despair just hours before. The crowd had grown to include people from 3 counties, drawn by word of mouth and social media posts about the singing horse miracle. Among the newcomers was Cordelia's sister, Prudence McAllister, who had driven down from Billings after seeing Quincy Blackthorne's news report on the afternoon broadcast. When Cisco saw Prudence approaching the fence, his reaction was immediate and profound. The horse trotted directly to her, pressing his forehead against her chest in a gesture of recognition and greeting. Prudence, who shared her late sister's gift for singing, began "How great thou art" in a voice so similar to Cordelia's that several people in the crowd gasped audibly. "He remembers me," Prudence whispered, tears streaming down her face as she stroked Cisco's mane. Cordelia always said animals never forget love, even when it comes from someone they haven't seen in a while. Bill joined Prudence at the fence, and together they sang the hymn that had started Cisco's recovery. The horse stood perfectly still between them, his head raised toward the sky as if he were listening for harmony from beyond the physical realm. In that moment, the 3 of them, man, woman, and horse, seemed connected by invisible threads of memory and love that death could not sever. The afternoon brought an unexpected visitor, Nashville recording artist Beauregard Sterling, who happened to be passing through Montana on his way to a concert in Missoula. He'd heard about the story on local radio and decided to make a detour. When he arrived with his guitar and offered to provide musical accompaniment to the ongoing hymn singing, the effect was nothing short of magical. Sterling's professional quality voice and expert guitar work transformed the gathering from a community sing-along into something approaching a concert of healing. He knew all of Cordelia's favorite hymns and many more besides, leading the crowd through a repertoire that spanned generations of American spiritual music. With each song, Cisco seemed to grow stronger, more vibrant, more like his old self. As evening approached, the horse was not only eating and drinking normally, but was actively seeking attention from visitors, pressing his nose against outstretched hands and nickering softly when children sang to him. The transformation was complete, from a dying animal consumed by grief to a living testament to the power of music, memory, and community to heal even the deepest wounds. 3 weeks later, Cisco had not only returned to full health, but was thriving in ways that amazed everyone who had witnessed his near-death experience. Bill had established a daily routine of singing to the horse each morning and evening, often joined by neighbors who had become regular visitors to the ranch. What had started as a desperate attempt to save a beloved animal had evolved into something far more significant, a community ritual of healing and hope. Dr. Crow documented Cisco's complete recovery in a case study that would later be published in the Journal of Veterinary Behavior. Titled Music Therapy in Equine Grief Recovery, a case study in interspecies emotional healing, the article drew attention from researchers around the world, but for Bill, the scientific recognition was far less important than the simple fact that his wife's beloved horse was alive and well. The story attracted visitors from across the country, many bringing their own stories of loss and healing. A grief support group from Denver began making monthly pilgrimages to the ranch, finding comfort in singing hymns with Cisco as their audience. The horse seemed to understand his role in these gatherings, standing quietly and attentively as people shared their stories and found solace in communal song. Bill converted the old tack room into a small chapel where visitors could sit quietly and reflect. He placed a simple wooden cross on the wall, along with a photograph of Cordelia singing to Cisco on a sunny Sunday morning. Just months before her death, beneath the photograph, he mounted a brass plaque with the words of "How Great Thou Art," engraved in elegant script on the one-year anniversary of Cordelia's death. Over 100 people gathered at the ranch for what had become known as Cisco's celebration. The horse, now fully restored to his former magnificence, seemed to understand the significance of the occasion. As the crowd began singing "How Great Thou Art," Cisco moved to the center of the paddock and performed the dance movements Cordelia had taught him, his body moving in perfect rhythm with the beloved hymn. Bill stood at the fence, his voice strong and sure as he led the singing, no longer the broken man who had nearly lost everything to grief. In saving Cisco, he had found his own path back to life, discovering that love multiplies when shared and that music truly is the language of the soul. As the sun set behind the crazy mountains, painting the sky in shades of gold and crimson, Cisco approached the fence where Bill stood. The horse gently nuzzled his master's shoulder, then lifted his head toward the evening sky and whinnied a sound of pure joy that seemed to carry across the valley like a hymn of gratitude for the gift of life itself. In that moment, Bill felt Cordelia's presence as surely as if she were standing beside him. He knew that somewhere beyond the visible world, she was smiling at the sight of her beloved horse healthy and happy, surrounded by a community that had learned the power of song to heal broken hearts. The music that had saved Cisco had also saved them all, creating bonds of love that would endure long after the final notes had faded into the Montana twilight. The story of the horse who remembered love through song became legend in Silverbow County. But for those who lived it, the real miracle wasn't the healing, it was the discovery that death cannot silence love, and that sometimes the most powerful medicine comes not from a pharmacy, but from the simple act of lifting one's voice in song, trusting that somewhere, someone is listening with the ears of the heart.